Okay, let's unpack this. What really drives conflict and cooperation in the world today? I mean, for decades, the maps we used, to understand global dynamics, they felt pretty clear.
Right, you had powerful nation states vying for influence, or maybe those huge ideological blocks, during the Cold War, squaring off.
Exactly. But what if those maps are just outdated now? What if something much older, something really fundamental like culture or civilization, is actually the main force shaping things?
It's a huge question, isn't it?
Mm.
And it became incredibly pressing, like the moment the Cold War scaffolding just vanished. Suddenly those old divisions, communism versus capitalism, they just didn't seem to explain the new patterns we were seeing. The world felt, well, different.
It really did. And that shift is precisely what we're diving into today. We've got some really thought-provoking source material here that grapples with this new reality, and it spans about 2 decades of pretty intense global transformation.
Okay, what are we looking at?
So our main sources are core excerpts from Samuel Huntington's hugely influential work on the clash of civilizations. He put that forward back in the early 1990s, right as the Cold War was ending.
But right at that pivot point.
Exactly. And then we've got this fascinating piece. It's drawn from a YouTube transcript, actually, called A Frail But Possible Future.
Oh, yeah.
And this one offers a perspective looking back on the world maybe 20 years after Huntington first laid out his theory.
Ah, okay. So it's like looking at a hypothesis proposed, right in the middle of radical change,
Mm-hmm.
and then seeing how someone later, someone actually living in the period Huntington described, saw those dynamics playing out on the ground.
That's exactly it. So our mission for this deep dive is first to really immerse ourselves in Huntington's foundational ideas. His argument that global politics was becoming multipolar and multi-civilizational, with identities rooted in culture and civilization taking center stage.
Instead of ideology or the nation state purely.
Right. Then we're going to turn to that later source. And what's really striking about it, as we'll see, is that it largely affirms Huntington's core idea, about the decline of the traditional nation state, the decline of those universal ideologies.
Okay, so it agrees with the big picture shift.
It does. But crucially, it adds this really specific, very tangible dimension to how that shift is actually manifesting. It introduces the concept of demographic wars.
Demographic wars. Okay, that sounds significant.
It is. And we're going to pull out the key insights from both sources, look at the examples they give, and really think about what this evolution in understanding global dynamics, well, what it tells us about the world we're navigating today.
Because getting a handle on these large-scale forces, this kind of intellectual framework, it really does help you make sense of so much of what you see happening in the news.
Totally.
The roots of ethnic conflicts, why international alignments shift, the rise of different kinds of identity politics, all those pressures on established political systems around the world. It gives you a lens, sort of.
It gives you a way to think about the currents underneath the daily headlines. So yeah, let's jump right into that crucial pivot point, the early 1990s, and explore Huntington's perspective on the world emerging from the Cold War's shadow.
Right. So Huntington was writing at a really unique moment. The Soviet Union had just collapsed, the Berlin Wall was down. There was this palpable sense of victory, of optimism in the West.
Yeah, the end of history talk.
Exactly. He calls it a brief illusion of harmony.
Mm-hmm.
Many people genuinely believed, that we were heading towards this universal, peaceful future dominated by democracy and market economies. Like history had sort of arrived at its final destination.
But Huntington, he looked closer, and he saw something far more complex and, frankly, less harmonious brewing. Almost immediately after the Cold War ended, he observed what he called a multiplication of ethnic conflicts just erupting around the world.
Often along cultural or religious lines, right?
Mm.
Lines that had maybe been suppressed or just overshadowed by the big Cold War conflict.
Precisely. He saw a breakdown of law and order in many places, a resurgence of, neo-communist and neo-fascist movements too, interestingly, and crucially, an intensification of religious fundamentalism across multiple faiths.
So his point wasn't that things weren't changing. Obviously they were.
Right.
It was that change didn't automatically mean progress or peace. The nature of global conflict was just transforming.
And central to his argument for understanding this new world was this idea that the fundamental units, the basic building blocks of human organization and interaction on the global stage, they were shifting.
Okay, how so?
He contended that for the first time in history, global politics had become genuinely multipolar and multi-civilizational. Those familiar lines drawn by competing ideologies, communism versus capitalism, they were fading fast. and identities rooted in culture and civilization were becoming paramount. The main forces shaping allegiances, antagonisms, conflicts.
Culture over ideology.
Yeah. He opens one of the excerpts with this really powerful image, almost poetic. He describes a meeting of Russian and American scholars in Moscow, January 1992, just weeks after the Soviet Union dissolved.
Wow, right in the immediate aftermath.
Exactly. The statue of Lenin, the ultimate symbol of the dead ideology, it had been removed from the stage. And in its place, the new flag of the Russian Federation.
A very symbolic replacement.
Totally. But the detail he zooms in on, the flag was hung upside down.
Ah, really?
Yeah. I mean, it's a small thing, maybe even comical on the surface, but he saw it as profoundly symbolic. It wasn't just about removing Lenin, the ideology. It was about the return, the reassertion of a national and cultural symbol, the Russian flag, even if, people were still figuring out exactly how to represent that new identity correctly.
That's a great anecdote. It vividly captures that rapid switch, doesn't it? From a world defined by these big political ideologies to one where rediscovered or reasserted national and cultural identities were suddenly front and center.
So, if civilizations are the new key players, how does he actually define civilization? It's not just a loose term for culture, is it?
No, he's quite specific. He calls it the highest cultural grouping of people. And the broadest level of cultural identity people have, short of that which distinguishes humans from other species, it's defined by a mix of things.
Like what?
Well, objective elements, things you can sort of point to and describe, like language, history, religion, customs, institutions. But just as importantly, maybe even more so, it's defined by subjective self-identification.
How people see themselves.
Exactly. It's about who people feel is part of the biggest we, that group they feel culturally at home in, distinct from, all the other thems out there.
And you mentioned religion as one of those objective elements. He places particular emphasis on that, right?
Crucial emphasis, yeah. He argues that, historically, the major civilizations, they've been deeply intertwined with the world's great religions. And he makes this really stark point. People might share ethnicity, they might share language, but if they differ in religion, they can still, quote, slaughter each other.
Wow. That's blunt.
It is. And he uses examples like the conflicts in Lebanon, the breakup of Yugoslavia, the historical violence on the Indian subcontinent between Hindus and Muslims. These illustrate his point vividly. In his view, religion often isn't just a factor, it's the single most important one, the core identity marker for civilizations.
It's also worth flagging the distinction he makes, isn't it, between civilization, singular, like the idea of being civilized versus barbarian.
Right, the old standard development, cities, literacy.
And civilizations, plural. He argues the world needs to move past applying a single, often Western standard, and instead recognize multiple distinct cultural groupings, each civilized in its own way, according to its own norms and values.
Absolutely. And as this multi-civilizational world was taking shape, Huntington observed this significant ongoing shift in the global balance of power. While the West was still incredibly powerful in the early 90s, no doubt.
Sure.
Its power relative to other civilizations was clearly declining.
He frames this very strongly. He says the expansion of the West was basically over, and the revolt against the West had begun. Non-Western societies, they weren't just the passive objects of Western history anymore, the colonized, the ones reacting to Western actions.
Right. They were increasingly becoming, as he put it, the movers and shapers of their own history and of Western history. They were asserting their own agency, finally, on the global stage.
And this rise of non-Western power, combined with these global forces of modernization, which often started in or were associated with the West, this presented non-Western societies with a really profound choice. How do we engage with the West? How do we engage with modernity?
Yeah, and Huntington outlined sort of three basic approaches they could take. The first was just complete rejection. Reject the West, reject modernization altogether. He pretty much dismisses this as hopeless in an increasingly interconnected world.
Hard to cut yourself off completely.
Exactly. The second he calls Kemalism, named after Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey.
Okay, what's that?
This is a really radical, top-down attempt to essentially erase the indigenous culture and import a completely new one, mainly from the West. Ataturk famously tried to rapidly transform Turkey away from its Ottoman, Muslim past secularization, intense nationalism, adopting Western laws, script, political systems. It's like a forced traumatic cultural break.
Trying to fast-track Westernization.
Right. And the third choice which Huntington sees as the most common and maybe the most successful among non-Western elites, is reformism.
Reformism. Okay.
This approach tries to find a way to combine modernization, developing industry, technology, modern institutions, things you need, with preserving their own indigenous culture, their core values, their own institutions. The goal is to modernize without fully Westernizing, without losing your distinct identity.
You modernize on your own terms, sort of.
Pretty much. And he gives some really compelling examples of this reformist strategy, that classic Chinese slogan, Chinese learning for the fundamental principles, Western learning for practical use.
Ah, right. Keep your core philosophy, use their tech.
Exactly. Or the Japanese idea, Japanese spirit, Western technique, same concept. The source also mentions attempts within the Islamic world to reconcile Islam with modernity, arguing that Islam is compatible with modern science, with Western thought, trying to find an Islamic rationale for accepting modern ideas and institutions.
So it highlights that the issue isn't really whether a pious Muslim can, operate a modern factory or use advanced weapons. Clearly, they can.
Of course. The challenge is reconciling the values and the societal organization of traditional Islam with those of a modern, often secular society. That's the deeper tension.
And this process of reformism, this drive to modernize but keep your own culture, this leads right into what Huntington calls the indigenization phenomenon.
Indigenization, okay.
Yeah. As Western power and influence shrink relative to others, non-Western elites, even those educated in the West, totally familiar with Western ways, they start to indigenize themselves and their societies. They increasingly realize their power, their success, depends not on aligning with the West, but on succeeding within their own cultural context, accommodating the values of their own people.
This is where those biographical examples from the source really hit home, isn't it?
Yeah, they're fascinating. He talks about figures like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, founder of Pakistan, Harry Lee, who became Lee Kuan Yew, first Prime Minister of Singapore, Solomon Bandaranaike, Prime Minister of Sri Lanka.
All highly Western-educated individuals. Jinnah was this brilliant secular lawyer trained in England. Lee Kuan Yew, Cambridge-educated. Some called him the best bloody Englishman east of Suez. Bandaranaike, from a prominent Sri Lankan family, Oxford-educated, initially raised Christian.
Right. But to lead their new nations, or their modernizing nations, they had to connect with their own cultures. Jinnah, the secularist, becomes the fervent leader appealing to Islamic identity to create Pakistan.
Lee Kuan Yew, the Englishman, learns Mandarin, actively promotes Confucian values as key to Singapore's success.
And Bandaranaike converts to Buddhism, bases his political platform on Sinhalese nationalism and Buddhism. They changed names, sometimes their clothes, their public beliefs. They actively promoted their ancestral cultures, their religions.
And he argues it wasn't just, political opportunism. It was a necessary re-embedding within their own civilizational identities. Because the world was changing, Western dominance was receding.
And a major engine driving both this indigenization and this broader reassertion of cultural identity globally, Huntington argues, is this worldwide phenomenon he saw starting back in the 1970s, the global religious resurgence.
Ah, the unsecularization of the world. That's a famous phrase of his.
It is. And he stresses it's not just about the rise of a few fundamentalist movements, although they're part of it. It's broader, deeper, a return to the sacred, manifesting in people's daily lives, their workplaces, influencing government policy in really diverse societies.
And it affected all the major world religions, right? Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Orthodoxy. They all experienced this significant surge in commitment among their populations.
He notes the particularly rapid and significant expansion of Islam and Christianity during this period, especially in Africa and places like South Korea.
Does he speculate why?
He does, a bit. He suggests that perhaps traditional religions, often those closely linked to the state, maybe struggled to meet the really profound psychological, emotional, social needs of people grappling with rapid, often disruptive modernization.
Leaving a vacuum, maybe?
Exactly. Leaving space for other, perhaps more dynamic or personally resonant, religious expressions to spread and flourish. He mentions Christianity spreading in places like China and Singapore, sometimes even despite government efforts to contain it.
And he makes an interesting contrast here, too, doesn't he? Between this religious revival elsewhere and what he calls Asian affirmation in Confucian societies.
Right. That affirmation, he says, takes a primarily cultural form, emphasizing values like discipline, community, family, hard work, rather than being overtly religious in the same way, although those values are often linked to Confucian teachings.
Okay, let's dig into that Asian affirmation a bit more. He identifies what, 4 key components driving it?
Yeah, 4 main things. First, and maybe most straightforwardly, is just the reality of sustained economic growth.
Yeah.
Decades of it. And the tangible increase in power that brings relative to the West.
Right. These societies had seen incredible development, and they believed, they were on track to surpass the West economically, which naturally translates into more global clout.
Which leads directly to the second component, the end of what he calls the era of awe towards the West, and the beginning of the era of talking back.
I like that phrase, era of talking back.
Me too. As their own power grew, Asian leaders, Asian societies, they felt less intimidated by the West, more confident asserting their own interests, their values, their perspectives on the global stage. He quotes a Malaysian official saying something like, "Even a high fever in America will not make Asia cough."
That's vivid. Shows that newfound confidence, that sense of independence.
Definitely. Third, while obviously recognizing the diversity within Asia, East Asian leaders and thinkers argued there were significant commonalities among their societies, often linked back to those Confucian values. Thrift, family loyalty, hard work, discipline.
And they saw these values as key to their economic success, right? And also underpinning a kind of shared rejection of Western individualism.
Exactly, which often led to preferences for what they called soft authoritarianism or limited democracy. They viewed that as more compatible with their cultural norms. They saw common interests rooted in these shared cultural values, interests that diverged from Western ones.
Okay. And the fourth component?
This growing sense of commonality and divergent interests naturally led to a push for greater intra-Asian cooperation. Regionalism. He gives the example of Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad advocating for an East Asian Economic Caucus.
Right, based specifically on those shared cultural commonalities.
Yes, and it was designed to exclude Western powers like the U.S. and Canada. It was about, as they put it, the Asianization of Asia, a conscious effort to build regional structures, regional identity, based on shared culture.
Okay, so you got this really complex mix of internal dynamics happening.
Yeah.
Indigenization of elites, this global religious resurgence, the specific form of Asian cultural affirmation, all reinforcing and being reinforced by this broader shift towards a world where civilizational identity is becoming the primary marker.
Right, so the big question then is, how does Huntington see these distinct civilizations interacting with each other? This is where the clash part really comes in.
Yeah. He argues that intercivilizational relations will be, quote, almost never close, usually cool, and often hostile. Those tight alliances from the Cold War based on ideology, they just dissolve, replaced by relationships marked by distance, potential antagonism.
He suggests descriptors like Cold Peace or even Cold War are more fitting. He actually brings up the old Spanish historical term La Guerra Fría, the Cold War, which they used for their long, tense coexistence with the Muslim world.
And he saw many in the 90s perceiving a similar civilizational Cold War re-emerging, particularly between Islam and the West.
And within this framework, the most dangerous conflicts, the potentially most intractable ones in his view, are fault line wars.
Fault line wars, okay.
These are conflicts that happen between groups from different civilizations. He gives examples like Bosnia Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, Muslim Bosnians, Chechnya Orthodox Russians, Muslim Chechens, the Israeli-Arab conflict, Jewish Israelis, Muslim and Christian Arabs, India and Pakistan Hindu versus Muslim identities.
Conflicts literally on the borders, the fault lines between these civilizational blocks.
Exactly. And the key danger in these fault line wars, what makes them so persistent, so hard to resolve, is what he calls the kin country syndrome.
Right. Explain that again.
When a group from one civilization is fighting a group from another, their civilization kin elsewhere in the world are highly likely to mobilize support for them. Moral support, diplomatic, financial, material aid, even volunteer fighters.
And this kin country syndrome gets powerfully amplified by modern communication and global migration.
Totally. Diasporous communities living outside their ancestral homelands, they can learn instantly about conflicts involving their kin. And they become really potent forces for mobilizing support, sending money, weapons, maybe even fighters back home. Huntington notes that even minimal external aid from a kin country can have a huge impact on these conflicts.
Because the primary parties involved are often smaller groups, maybe embryonic states, not massive, fully resourced powers. So even a little outside help can tip the balance.
Precisely. Now, beyond these fault line conflicts, Huntington also talks about the potential for larger, maybe more catastrophic core state conflicts.
Wars between the big players of different civilizations.
Yeah, driven by fundamental shifts in the global power balance. He contrasts the relatively peaceful handover of global leadership from the UK to the US Pax Britannica to Pax Americana,
Okay.
with the potential for conflict between, say, a rising power like China and the established West, specifically the US. That peaceful UK-US transition, he argues, was possible largely because of the very close cultural kinship between them.
Ah, they were part of the same broad Western civilization.
Right. But a power transition between core states of fundamentally different civilizations, lacking that shared cultural foundation, that, he warns, could be far more volatile, far more dangerous.
The source also brings up a very notable and obviously sensitive data point regarding Islam's role in conflict during that period Huntington was looking at.
Yes, it does. It states that while Muslims made up about 1/5 of the world's population in the 1990s, they were, quote, far more involved in intergroup violence than the people of any other civilization.
Okay. And the source is careful how it presents that, right?
Very careful. It presents it as an observation from the time and then discusses potential explanations that were being debated, acknowledging the complexity. It mentions factors some people attributed to Islamic societies themselves, maybe militaristic traditions or difficulties integrating.
But also external factors.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. It highlights historical grievances, pointing to an argument made by Muslims that centuries of Western imperialism and perceived weakness in the 19th and 20th centuries made Muslim communities seem vulnerable, easy targets, fostering a kind of Muslim as victim narrative that could itself fuel conflict.
But the source doesn't definitively endorse any single explanation.
No, not at all. And it points out limitations, like the victim argument doesn't easily explain conflicts where Muslims are majorities fighting non-Muslim minorities. It presents these as complex, multifaceted discussions happening at the time, not settled facts.
And the nature of these conflicts, whether fault line wars or others involving Islamic societies, often follows a particular pattern described in the source, right? About moderates versus radicals.
Exactly. It says moderates tend to lose out to radicals when negotiations fail or when conflict escalates. As the violence persists, as compromises prove elusive, the more extreme factions gain influence. And their demands often escalate from maybe autonomy to independence or even more radical goals.
We've seen that pattern play out, haven't we? The source gives examples.
It does. The Moro conflict in the Philippines, Sudan's civil war, the Israeli-Arab conflict, Chechnya, Tajikistan. In each case, initial, maybe moderate demands and actors were often pushed aside by more hardline groups with increasingly radicalized messages as the conflict dragged on.
And it specifically highlights the shift among Bosnian Muslims during the war in the 90s.
Yes, initially many were secular, favored a multicultural Bosnia, but the sheer brutality of the conflict pushed them towards identifying more strongly with Islam. And they ended up electing a devout Muslim leader whose influential book argued for the fundamental incompatibility of Islam and non-Islamic political systems. The conflict itself drove that cultural and religious re-identification.
So the conflict reinforces the civilizational identity.
It seems so. Immigration is also flagged as a major intercivilizational issue, particularly concerning Muslim migrants moving into Western countries. The source mentions efforts in places like France and Britain during the 90s to limit non-European immigration, and it notes the slightly different but still a complex dynamic in the U.S.
And this ties back to Huntington's broader point, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That more interaction between civilizations doesn't necessarily lead to harmony or a universal identity.
Quite the opposite, he argues. It actually highlights the differences, makes civilizational identity more salient. People define who they are, he says, often by what they are not. More contact just brings those distinctions into sharper focus.
Okay. And finally, looking inward at the West itself, back in the mid-1990s, Huntington identified some potential vulnerabilities, didn't he? Sources of potential decay.
He did. He points to economic stuff, lower rates of growth, saving, investment compared to dynamic Asian economies, a societal focus on consumption rather than the building future power, low population growth rates in many Western countries.
What about immigration for the West? Did he see that as a solution?
Potentially, yes. A source of renewed vigor, but with a big caveat. Only if migrants are both qualified and, crucially, culturally assimilated into Western societies. And he suggested that assimilation could be a really significant challenge, especially for European countries receiving large numbers of non-Western, particularly Muslim immigrants.
He also noted the weakening of Christianity in Europe, right? Widespread indifference, though less so maybe in America where religiosity seemed higher. He saw that as a concern, maybe a long-term threat rather than an immediate crisis.
But he saw a more immediate, more significant challenge to the West, particularly the United States, and that was the challenge to the American creed itself.
How so?
He discusses how emerging ideas of multiculturalism in the 90s seemed to be substituting group rights for individual rights. And he saw individual rights as the absolute core of the American identity, an identity historically based on a political creed, liberty, equality, individualism, rather than a shared cultural or ethnic core like many other nations.
And this raised a really provocative question in his work, didn't it?
A huge one. The source quotes him asking essentially, what happens then to the United States if that ideology is disavowed by a significant portion of its citizens? In a world increasingly defined by culture, by fundamental identities, what happens to a society whose identity is primarily based on an abstract political creed?
And he pointed to the fate of the Soviet Union, another ideologically defined superpower, as a kind of sobering parallel, suggesting, quite controversially, that liberalism could potentially be the next domino to fall after Marxism.
It's a heavy thought. So, okay, that's a deep dive into Huntington's influential perspective from the early 90s. A world where the old maps, ideology, nation-states are being replaced by a new one defined by civilizational identity, marked by shifting power, fault-line conflicts, religious resurgence, and internal Western vulnerabilities. A world where culture is the fundamental driver.
Exactly. Now, let's fast forward 20 years or so. Our second source, that transcript, A Frail But Possible Future, it's written looking back on this very period. Essentially from within the era Huntington predicted.
Right. And what's so insightful about this later source is, okay, it doesn't explicitly name Huntington, but it implicitly and very clearly agrees with his core premise. It agrees that the world has moved beyond those old structures of ideological or nation-state dominance.
How does it phrase it?
It talks about the decline of superstructured, monolithic, ideologically defined nations. It confirms that observation. The post-Cold War world really is a world where the traditional nation-state, especially those defined by imposed ideologies or maybe artificial colonial boundaries, it's no longer the primary, unchallenged unit.
Okay, so it sees the same big-picture outcome that Huntington predicted, the decline of the traditional nation-state model.
It does. But where it adds this critical new dimension, this really tangible observation from living through those 20 years, is in identifying how this decline and those civilizational pressures Huntington talked about are actually manifesting on the ground.
And this is where demographic wars comes in.
Exactly. This is the key insight from the later source. Demographic war is the term it uses to describe the specific type of conflict and relentless pressure being put on the post-colonial system of nation-states. It's a concrete description of the forces that are, in its view, eroding the traditional state structure from within and without. A direct consequence of what it calls the age of the antithesis to the end of history hypothesis.
The world where fundamental identities, not universal ideologies, are king.
Precisely. And the source goes on to describe the nature of these demographic wars. Who's fighting them? It says these nation-states are under relentless attacks from both the civilizational and economic pressures.
Which lines up perfectly with Huntington, doesn't it? The reassertion of cultural identities, civilizational pressure, and the shifting global power balance driven by economic growth elsewhere, economic pressure. The later source sees these as the driving forces behind these wars on the state system.
And the actors in these conflicts, according to this later source, they aren't traditional armies of nation-states. They're described as small community or ethnic units.
Which resonates strongly with Huntington's focus on sub-state identities, right? Those players in the fault line conflicts.
It does. But the description of how these units operate is where the later source gives us crucial detail, looking back from that 20-year vantage point. It notes these units are often dispersed geographically, maybe across borders, maybe within cities, but they quickly and almost organically regrouped into community groups of various sizes and characteristics.
Organically regrouped.
Yeah.
That highlights their decentralized nature, right? Fluid, adaptable.
Yeah.
Very different from the rigid, centrally controlled structures of older nation-states.
Exactly. And this organic, flexible nature, the source argues, gives them significant advantages. These new entities can apparently mobilize in ways that no mechanistic or ideological supernation could compete with. There's this sense of effectiveness, dynamism, attributed to this community-based, decentralized organization that traditional states really struggle to counter.
And the source adds a modern twist too, right, about technology.
Yeah, it mentions they organize through collaborative decision-making, utilizing advanced data manipulation and analysis tools. So this isn't just, old-school tribalism, it's culturally rooted identity, but it's leveraging modern tech and organizational methods to achieve its goals.
And the fundamental reason they're successful, according to this later source.
It boils down to what it calls a natural gravitation towards the most fundamental, which just echoes Huntington's core argument, doesn't it? The return to the sacred, to culture, to identity as the primary organizing principle now. The later source sees these demographic wars as the tangible result of this return to the fundamental, community units organizing around these deep identities to challenge the state.
So if we connect the two sources, the concept of demographic wars from the later source, it offers this specific, observable description of how the civilizational and cultural pressures Huntington predicted are manifesting, how they're eroding the traditional nation-state system 20 years into the era he foresaw.
Yeah, it gives a name, demographic wars, to the process Huntington saw emerging. It describes the actors, these fluid community units, their organization decentralized, tech-enabled, and the pressures driving its civilizational and economic, dismantling those post-colonial state structures.
It's like Huntington gave us the geological map, right?
Yeah.
Showing the tectonic plates shifting after the Cold War earthquake, predicting where the stress points, the fault lines would appear based on those deep civilizational structures.
Good analogy.
And 20 years later, this second source looks at the surface effects, the actual ground shaking, and says, yep, the Earth's crust is cracking right along those lines. We're calling these observable tremors and shifts demographic wars. And they're being caused by these specific localized movements along the faults, these community units using new tools, driven by that fundamental pressure Huntington identified.
That's a really useful way to put it. It confirms the broad shift away from the nation-state and ideology that Huntington saw, but it specifies the form this challenge takes pressure and conflict on the post-colonial state system. And the nature of the actors involved, their methods. It shows how that return to the sacred, that rise of the fundamental, is physically impacting state structures through these decentralized dynamic community units.
Okay. The title of that later source is A Frail But Possible Future. The frail part seems pretty clear from everything we've discussed. Why might this future be seen as frail?
Well, based on these sources, the frailty seems to stem directly from the instability these demographic wars create. It's that relentless, decentralized pressure they put on established nation-states, which often just lack the flexibility, maybe the legitimacy, to respond electively.
It's the unpredictable nature of conflicts waged by these fluid, organic community groups, right?
Yeah.
Instead of clearly defined state actors with clear chains of command.
Exactly. It's a world where the old structures are weakening, and these new forms of organization and conflict are dynamic, potentially volatile, and they challenge all our traditional notions of order and sovereignty. It feels inherently unstable, frail.
Okay, so that's the frail part. But what makes it a possible future? What glimmer of possibility does this source offer, even if it doesn't spell it out in detail?
It's more of a hint, really. It suggests a future where, despite these ongoing pressures, there's a recognition that navigating transactions between these diverse ethnic community units is key. It talks about sharing existence in a collectively cherished biosphere and the resourceful universe.
So it implies that maybe finding ways for these fundamental community units to interact, to coexist, perhaps beyond just conflict, is necessary.
It seems to imply that, while the state structure is under threat, maybe the possibility exists for these more fundamental entities to find some mode of interaction that allows for a shared future, however fragile that possibility might feel.
Okay, so let's try to summarize impartially, drawing only from these two sources. Samuel Huntington, back in the early 90s, argued the post-Cold War world would be mapped and shaped primarily by civilizational and cultural identity, replacing the old divisions. He predicted conflicts along fault lines, pressure on states.
Right. And the later source, looking back 20 years into this predicted era, largely affirms this fundamental shift away from traditional nation-state ideological dominance. It describes the tangible impact as demographic wars, post-colonial nation-states attacked, eroded by decentralized, dynamic community units.
And these units organize around fundamental identities, cultural, ethnic, religious, leveraging modern tech, operating under those relentless civilizational and economic pressures.
It's a powerful synthesis, isn't it? Huntington gives us the macro-level theory of the civilizational shift. The later source, living inside that shift, provides this micro-level, 20 years later observation of how that shift is physically impacting the state system through these demographic wars, waged by these fluid fundamental community units.
So why should this intellectual map matter to you, the listener, right now?
Because understanding that identity rooted in culture, religion, ethnicity is a primary driver, it gives you this crucial lens. A lens to view so much of what's happening. It helps explain why certain ethnic or religious conflicts seem so intractable, why migration can be such a flashpoint, why identity politics is rising within so many countries, or why shifts in global power aren't just about economics but involve these deep cultural reassertions.
Yeah, it gives you a framework for analyzing the underlying causes of instability, of change, that go beyond just purely political or economic explanations. It really challenges that comfortable assumption, that the world is just a collection of rational states acting in their self-interest.
Or that one model liberal democracy, free markets, will just inevitably become universal.
Exactly. It forces you to confront the enduring power of culture, of identity, in shaping human affairs on a global scale.
It's a complex picture, definitely, but one that feels incredibly relevant to the world unfolding around us right now.
Absolutely.
So we've journeyed from Huntington's map of a multi-civilizational world, laid out right at the end of the Cold War. We explored the core ideas: civilizational identity, shifting power, fault line conflicts, the return to the sacred, those internal Western vulnerabilities.
And then we move forward 20 years to see how that later perspective, situated within that predicted era, largely affirmed the decline of traditional states and ideologies, but added that critical, tangible concept of demographic wars.
Conflicts waged by dynamic, decentralized community units organizing around fundamental identities under civilizational and economic pressures.
We saw how that later source doesn't just repeat Huntington, but gives a specific, observable description of how the forces he identified are impacting the nation-state system, especially post-colonial states, highlighting the shift in the nature of conflict and the actors involved.
And it leaves us with this vision of a world where the core units of organization, of conflict maybe, are shifting downwards, away from the state level towards smaller, more fundamental, culturally defined groups that are using modern tools and strategies in what the later source calls these demographic wars.
Leading back to that title, a future that's potentially frail because of this instability, this pressure on the state system, but maybe possible if these fundamental units can somehow find ways to coexist or interact constructively.
So, based only on these sources and the perspectives they offer, here's a final thought for you to consider. If global politics is increasingly shaped, and even traditional nation-states are being eroded, by these flexible, decentralized community groups mobilizing around fundamental identities, ethnic, religious, cultural, and these groups are leveraging data, collaboration, in these so-called demographic wars, what new challenges does this create for traditional state diplomacy, for existing international institutions, even for our own personal understanding of belonging and identity in the years to come?
Yeah, how do you navigate and make sense of a world where power and conflict aren't just held by national capitals or global corporations, but seem to be bubbling up from these organic, culturally rooted units?
It certainly suggests the old rule book might be increasingly out of date.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into these powerful and sometimes unsettling ideas shaping the global landscape.